Ronnie O'Neal murder trial here in Tampa.
3-year-old Julian Wood and injuring his mother.
Charged with first-degree murder in the death of her young son.
From kids who made a scene to tug at the jury's heartstrings to cold-blooded killers who could not care less, these cases shocked entire communities, and the courts did not go easy. The only thing some of these people seemed sorry about was getting caught. From killers who cursed out the court to parents who looked their own kids' photos in the face and felt nothing. Ronnie O'Neal.
Recording from her phone did not record calls sped up like that.
This case comes out of Riverview, Florida, back in March of 2018. Ronnie O'Neal III was 28 years old at the time, living with his girlfriend Kenyatta Barron and their 2 kids. Kenyatta was 33, their daughter Ron Nivea was 9, and their son was 8. Ron Nivea had cerebral palsy and could not speak. This was a household with a long history of instability, and on this night, it boiled over in the worst way imaginable. On March 18th, things between O'Neal and Kenyatta got violent. O'Neal beat Kenyatta and then shot her with a shotgun. While she was on the phone with 911, pleading for her life, he kept attacking her. Then he turned to his daughter. He used a hatchet on Ron Nivea, striking her in the back and the head. His son, the only one who survived that night, would later testify that he watched his sister get hit and saw her eyes roll back. O'Neal then went after his son too, stabbing him multiple times. He doused the boy and the house in gasoline and set it on fire. The son managed to get out, suffering 2nd and 3rd degree burns along with stab wounds, and was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. O'Neal's stepfather later told the jury he got a frantic call from Ronnie that night, saying Kenyatta was trying to kill him, but the call was full of noise before it suddenly cut off. By the time relatives rushed over, the home was already a crime scene, and O'Neal's son was on a ventilator with tubes running through his neck and chest. O'Neal was arrested that night. He was found not competent to stand trial in 2018, but by 2019 doctors cleared him to go forward. When the trial finally happened in June of 2021, O'Neal made the choice to represent himself. During jury selection, he openly told potential jurors that he believed in the death penalty, and that anyone who committed crimes like the ones he was accused of deserved to die for them. He gave a rambling opening statement where he admitted to killing Kenyatta but denied killing his daughter or trying to kill his son. Then came the moment that made headlines everywhere. O'Neal cross-examined his own, one-year-old son on the stand, the same boy he had stabbed and set on fire. The cross-examination lasted only a few minutes, and at one point O'Neal simply thanked the detective who had since adopted his son. The boy, who was just 8 years old when his father attacked him, had to sit there and answer questions from the man who had tried to burn him alive 3 years earlier. That moment alone was enough to make this case stand out, but it wasn't the only time O'Neal turned the courtroom into a spectacle. He yelled at witnesses, interrupted prosecutors, and at times seemed more focused on performing for the gallery than actually defending himself. The jury didn't take long. After about 4.5 hours of deliberation, they found O'Neal guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, aggravated child abuse, arson, and resisting a law enforcement officer. During the penalty phase, the jury chose not to recommend the death penalty, instead recommending life without parole. In July of 2021, Judge Michelle handed down the formal sentence, 3 consecutive life terms plus an additional 90 years, guaranteeing O'Neal will never leave prison. She called it the worst case she had seen in 19 years on the bench. During sentencing, O'Neal took the stand and told Kenyatta's mother directly that he was not sorry for what he, in his words, did not do. Kenyatta's mother had hoped for the death penalty and said she felt the trial had been turned into a mockery, especially after watching O'Neal yell at jurors and blame Kenyatta for her own murder throughout the proceedings. She told the court that O'Neal had stolen angels from her family, and she broke down in tears for most of her statement. Bianca Ellis.
This was for him today.
Justice for Julian. A jury found Bianca Ellis.
Trial. Testimony is wrapped for the day with a central question for jurors remaining. Was Ellis legally insane when she killed 3-year-old Julian Wood outside of a grocery store last June? Or did she know exactly what she was doing?
All rise.
And Bianca Ellis's family. Again, Ellis was found guilty on all 9 charges, including aggravated murder.
This one happened in 2024 in North Olmsted, Ohio, and it's still fairly fresh. What makes it so unsettling is that it was completely random. On the 3rd of June 2024, a 3-year-old boy named Julian Wood was out with his mother Margot, doing some shopping at a Giant Eagle grocery store. Before any of that, a 32-year-old woman named Bianca Ellis had walked into a thrift store right next door and stolen 2 knives. She then walked into the Giant Eagle, and according to prosecutors, she spotted Julian and his mother and started following them. When Margot finished checking out and headed to her car with Julian in the shopping cart, Ellis followed them into the parking lot. She ran at the cart and stabbed Julian multiple times while he sat there. Margot tried to pull her son out to save him, and Ellis stabbed her too. Police arrived within minutes and found Ellis walking down the road still holding the knife, and she was arrested on the spot. Julian was taken to the hospital but could not be saved. Margot survived her injuries, though the family says the damage from that day is something they're still dealing with. At sentencing, Margot described trying to put herself between Ellis and her son, and having to watch Ellis just walk away afterward like nothing had happened. Police said at the time that the mother and son had been picked at random, and that Ellis had no connection to either of them. The case stalled because Ellis was found incompetent to stand trial in late 2024. She had a documented history of mental health issues, including multiple hospitalizations and a pattern of not staying on her medication. After months of treatment, doctors said by early 2025 she had improved enough to understand the proceedings and assist her lawyers. Her defense argued she was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming she had blacked out and heard voices telling her to hurt someone or hurt herself. During an evaluation, Ellis reportedly told a doctor she had gone to the Giant Eagle that day, hoping to calm herself down by looking at the lobster tank, and that she had been drinking before the attack. She said she didn't fully realize what she had done until she was sitting in a jail cell, and that's when she said she finally cried. A psychologist for the defense testified that Ellis didn't understand her actions were wrong at the time. The trial started in early October of 2025, and both sides agreed. On the basic facts, Ellis was the one who killed Julian. The real argument was over her state of mind. On the 15th of October 2025, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found Ellis guilty on every count, including aggravated murder, felonious assault, child endangering, and aggravated theft. Less than 2 weeks later, on October 27th, Judge John Russo handed down the maximum possible sentence: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, Julian's mother addressed Ellis directly and told her she hated her with every fiber of her being. The judge told the family that nothing he could say would ever capture the size of what they had lost, and that their lives had been forever changed the moment Ellis decided to follow them out of that store. Julian would have turned 5, just 2 days after his killer was sentenced. Julian's family also filed a separate lawsuit against the grocery store chain, arguing the company had put profits over the safety of its customers. Ellis is now serving life without parole, with no further proceedings expected. Christopher Watts.
Raw drama in court as the cold-hearted killer who murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters is sentenced.
Considered the arguments made by the attorneys. The court has considered the statements made by the victims in this case. The court's going to find that the plea agreement is fair and reasonable under the circumstances.
Now this one you've probably heard of, because it became one of the most talked about cases in recent true crime history. On the surface, Chris and Shanann Watts looked like a normal young family living the suburban dream just outside Denver. They lived in Frederick, Colorado, with their 2 daughters, Bella, who was 4, and Celeste, who was 3. Shanann was also 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy they planned to name Nico. In August of 2018, Shanann and the girls were reported missing, and Chris went on local news begging them to come home. He looked like a grieving husband, pleading into the camera for his family to return. But investigators were already starting to notice things didn't add up. It turned out Watts had been having an affair with a co-worker, and prosecutors said he had been researching secluded vacation spots for a future with his new girlfriend, all while his pregnant wife and kids were away visiting family, out of state. Investigators found photos showing Watts at a national park with his girlfriend during that same trip. When Shanann came home and confronted him, Watts strangled her to death. He then smothered both of his daughters. He drove all 3 bodies to an oil work site where he was employed and dumped them there, burying Shanann in a shallow grave and placing his daughter's bodies inside separate oil tanks on the property. These were the same tanks he had worked around for years, the same property he clocked into every morning, and yet he put his own children's bodies inside them like they were nothing. Once police started piecing together his lies and the affair came to light, Watts confessed. In November of 2018, he pleaded guilty to all 9 charges, 5 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased body, and 1 count of unlawfully terminating a pregnancy. This was part of a plea deal that spared him the death penalty, something Shanann's own family pushed for, with her mother telling prosecutors that Watts had made the choice to take those lives and she didn't want to be the one making the choice to take his. At sentencing, Judge Marcelo Kopkow called it the most inhumane and vicious crime he had handled in thousands of cases. Watts was given 5 life sentences without parole, 3 consecutive, 2 concurrent plus 48 years for the pregnancy charge, and 12 years for each count of tampering with the bodies. When given the chance to speak, Watts declined. He sat with his head down for most of the hearing, leg bobbing under the table, while his own parents had a statement read on their behalf and Shanann's family called him a monster directly to his face. He offered no explanation for why he did it, and the district attorney said afterward he doubted Watts would ever give an honest account of how he carried it out. Watts was later moved out of Colorado entirely and is now serving his sentences at an out-of-state facility for safety reasons. The case became so widely covered that Netflix released a documentary on it in 2020 called American Murder: The Family Next Door, built from police footage, text messages, and Shanann's own social media videos from the days leading up to her death. What made the documentary hit so hard was how normal everything looked right up until the end. Shanann posting about her pregnancy, texting friends about her marriage, completely unaware of what was coming. The contrast between the life she thought she was living and what Chris Watts was actually planning behind her back is part of what made this case impossible for people to stop talking about. Seth Welch and Tatiana Fusari.
Our News 8's Zach Horner has more from the courtroom and reaction from the couple's Cedar Springs neighbors.
Over 2 months have passed.
This one takes us to Solon Township, Michigan, a small community just north of Grand Rapids. Seth Welch and Tatiana Fusari were a young couple raising several kids together, and in October of 2017 they had a daughter named Mary. By the 2nd of August 2018, when Mary was just 10 months old, she was found dead in her crib. She had weighed about 8 pounds at the time of her death. An autopsy found that Mary died from malnutrition and dehydration, and that she had likely been left alone in that crib for around 17 hours before anyone found her. When Welch called 911, he described his daughter as, in his words, dead as a doorknob, a detail the judge later said spoke volumes about how this baby had been treated. It also came out that Welch had called his own attorney about an hour and a half before he even called for emergency help, which the judge later pointed to as proof of how calculated his reaction was. A prosecutor told the jury that what Mary went through was nothing short of torture, describing how she had been left imprisoned in her crib on a filthy mattress with dirty diapers piled up around the home, evidence she had been fed at some point, but then largely abandoned. One prosecutor described Mary as looking like a 100-year-old baby, all skin and bones, and said the image of her visibly stunned everyone in the courtroom the first time her photos were shown. Both parents pointed to their religious beliefs and a deep distrust of doctors as reasons they never sought medical care for Mary, even though witnesses said it was obvious she was severely underweight and too weak to even move her arms or cry. Welch went to trial first, and in January of 2020, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse after less than 90 minutes of deliberation. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Fusari's case took a longer path. She initially pleaded no contest to lesser charges of second-degree murder and second-degree child abuse, agreeing to a minimum of 25 years. But after a Michigan Supreme Court ruling opened the door for a duress defense, she moved to withdraw that plea, which led to a full trial in the fall of 2021. On the stand, she described years of abuse at Welch's hands, saying he had pointed a rifle at her head and told her to get on her knees, and she argued that fear of him had kept her from getting Mary help. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. In November of 2021, she too was sentenced to life without parole, along with 15 to 30 years for the abuse charge running alongside it. At her sentencing, Judge Paul Denenfeld said, This was a tragic case where two parents had essentially watched their child starve to death, and he admitted he wasn't sure he would ever fully understand how something like that happens. Throughout both trials, neither parent showed much outward emotion when the photos of Mary's frail body were shown to the jury, photos that one prosecutor said visibly stunned everyone in the room. The couple's other children were removed from the home, and a fourth child born while Fusari was in jail awaiting trial was placed with relatives. Elis Ortiz Nieves.
There was evidence of that from the pictures. The bruises, some of the bruises were in the shape of a belt buckle.
I ain't gonna let you sit here and say that.
This case comes out of Gaines Township, near Grand Rapids, Michigan, back in 2017. Elis Ortiz Nieves was dating a woman named Sonia Hernandez. Hernandez had several young children from previous relationships, and Ortiz Nieves watched them while she was at work. On the 13th of June 2017, Ortiz Nieves was at home with the kids, including Hernandez's 4-year-old son Giovani Mahias, while she was at her job. That day, deputies were called to the home and found Giovani on the kitchen floor, actively dying. He was rushed to the hospital but couldn't be saved. An autopsy revealed the boy had suffered a 4-centimeter tear in his abdominal tissue along with a puncture in his bowels, causing him to bleed internally. On top of that, he had 7 separate blows to the head, and there were cigarette burns on his body that had clearly happened well before that final day. Ortiz Nieves told investigators that Giovani had been sick and that he had simply been poking at the boy's stomach to try to make him throw up. 6 other children, all under 11, were removed from the home that same day. The case went to trial in late 2017, and the jury returned guilty verdicts on felony murder and first-degree child abuse after only about an hour of deliberation. At sentencing in January of 2018, things got heated fast. As Judge Mark Trusock described Giovani's injuries in detail, mentioning that some of the bruises appeared to be in the shape of a belt buckle, Ortiz Nieves interrupted him, telling the judge that what he was saying was crazy. The judge replied that there was no question in his mind that Ortiz Nieves had done this, and shortly after, Ortiz Nieves became so upset that he had to be physically removed from the courtroom by deputies. Even after being brought back in, he kept insisting he was innocent, telling the judge he would take a lie detector test to prove he never abused any of those kids and never meant to hurt Giovani. The judge wasn't moved. He told Ortiz Nieves flat out that he was the lowest form of human life he had ever seen, called him a monster, called what he did sickening and disgusting, and said he should never be allowed out of prison. Ortiz Nieves was sentenced to life in prison without parole, the mandatory sentence under Michigan law for that kind of felony murder conviction. He later appealed, arguing his lawyer had been ineffective and that some of the trial testimony relied on bad science, while also objecting to jurors hearing about his past history of violence toward children. The Michigan Court of Appeals rejected every argument and upheld the conviction. Giovani's grandmother, Nora Villarreal Mulero, told reporters that Ortiz Nieves had torn their entire family apart. She said the family had visited Giovani's grave with balloons on what would have been his 5th birthday, since they couldn't celebrate it any other way. Julissa Thaler.
I'm innocent. Fuck you all. You're garbage.
Miss Thaler, I don't know that that's appropriate here.
Sorry, I told you what somebody else.
What I would say is, the worst thing that seems to happen to parents is to lose their child. It's worse though.
This one comes out of Minnesota, and it's one of the harder cases to sit through. Julissa Thaler was a 29-year-old mother locked in a bitter custody battle with her ex, Eli Hart, over their 6-year-old son Eli. Eli had previously been removed from Thaler's care and placed with a foster family, but just 10 days before this happened, a Dakota County Social Services agency had granted Thaler full custody of him again. Investigators later said Thaler appeared fixated on her ex when they questioned her. On the night of the 19th of May, 2022, while Eli sat in his booster seat in the back of her car, Thaler shot him with a shotgun. She fired as many as 9 shots into her own son, reloading the gun partway through, in what prosecutors described as one of the most tragic cases they had ever handled. Before the shooting, she had gone into a store and asked a clerk for ammunition that would, in her words, blow the biggest hole, a detail prosecutors later pointed to as evidence of premeditation. The next day, she drove around with his body still in the trunk of her car. A gas station camera reportedly caught her near a dumpster, where she tossed away some of his belongings, including his backpack. It was only when police pulled her over for a busted tire that was being driven on the rim, along with a shattered back window, that officers noticed blood on her hand and saw both a shotgun shell and a spent casing inside the car. At that point, officers actually let her go without realizing what had happened, but it didn't take long for investigators to connect the dots, and she was arrested days later once Eli's body was found in the trunk during a separate stop. She was initially charged with second-degree murder just 3 days after Eli's death, and the charges were later upgraded to include first-degree murder. In February of 2023, a jury found her guilty of both first- and second-degree murder after deliberating for less than 2 hours. At sentencing, Eli's stepmother and former foster mother gave emotional statements about who Eli really was beyond just being known as a murder victim, describing the bond he shared with his father and how the pain of losing him would never fully go away. Thaler's own defense rested without calling a single witness, and her lawyer acknowledged that she had participated in Eli's death while still arguing she hadn't technically committed the specific crime charged. The jury didn't agree. When Judge J. Quam asked if Thaler wanted to say anything before sentencing, she did. She said she was innocent, then told the courtroom, and I'm quoting here, "F you all, you're garbage." The judge calmly responded that the worst thing for any parent is to lose a child. But it's even worse when that child isn't lost to an accident or an illness. It's when someone takes that child from the world, and that person is the one who brought them into it. Thaler was sentenced to life in prison without parole, the mandatory sentence in Minnesota for a first-degree murder conviction. Eli's family said they planned to raise money for a playground in his honor in their hometown of Mound. His former foster mother, Nikita Kronberg, also spoke after sentencing, saying that Eli meant the world to so many people who had crossed paths with him during his short life, and that the family now hoped to focus on making sure nothing like this could happen to another child in a similar situation. Michelle Blair.
Why did you take the decision to pile the bodies on top of each other in a freezer?
What do you mean?
Why did you do that?
This case is out of Detroit, and it's the kind of story that made national news the moment it broke. It started with what should have been a routine eviction. In March of 2015, court officers showed up at an apartment to carry out that eviction. While clearing the place out, they opened a deep freezer sitting in the living room and found the bodies of 2 children wrapped in plastic. The kids were identified as Stony Ann Blair, who was 13, and her brother Stephen Gage Berry, who was 9. Their mother, 3-5-year-old Michelle Blair, had been living there with them, along with 2 of her other children, a 17-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. After being brought in for questioning, Blair confessed almost immediately, telling police she wasn't evil even as she was being handcuffed. She admitted that Stephen had died back in August of 2012 and that Stony had died about 9 months later in May of 2013, meaning their bodies had been sitting in that freezer for years before anyone discovered them. The medical examiner ruled both deaths homicides from blunt force trauma and found that Stephen also suffered thermal injuries before he died, on top of both kids being severely malnourished by the time they were killed. Because the bodies had been frozen for so long, they actually had to thaw for 3 days before an autopsy could even be performed. Blair's explanation was that she believed Stephen and Stony had sexually abused her younger son, and that's why she killed them. She told the court she had set out to kill Stony specifically, but said she hadn't realized the abuse she inflicted on Stephen months earlier would turn out to be fatal. She said she didn't report it to police because she was afraid of losing her other children. Investigators found no evidence to support her claims about the abuse ever happening. In June of 2015, Blair pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree premeditated murder and 1 count of felony murder, which under Michigan law carries a mandatory life sentence without parole. Other charges, including torture, were dropped as part of that plea, since the murder convictions alone guaranteed she would never be released. At sentencing the following month, Blair gave a rambling statement where she blamed the children's fathers for being absent and insisted she was the only one telling the truth. She had previously told the judge, on the record, that she didn't feel any remorse for what she called those demons. Judge Dana Hathaway told her that the greatest tragedy was that she had taken away her children's chance at a better life, and that she had imposed the death penalty on her own kids. Blair simply responded, "I did." She was sentenced to life in prison without parole at the Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan, where she remains to this day. A separate court hearing terminated Blair's parental rights to her 2 surviving children, who went to live with relatives, with one of them later being adopted. Years into her sentence, Blair pleaded guilty to assaulting a prison employee, adding even more time onto a sentence that already meant she would never walk free again. Lucy Letby.
A cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children.
This case comes from England, and it's become one of the most disturbing healthcare cases in modern UK history. Lucy Letby worked as a neonatal nurse at the Countess of Chester Hospital in a unit that cares for the most fragile newborns, the ones who need round-the-clock support just to survive. On the surface, she looked like any other nurse on the ward, someone parents would trust without a second thought during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. Between June of 2015 and June of 2016, a string of babies on that unit suddenly collapsed or died in ways that left doctors confused. Investigators built a case showing that Letby had been injecting infants with air, force-feeding them dangerous amounts of milk, tampering with their breathing tubes, and in at least 2 cases, poisoning them with insulin. What stood out was a pattern. Letby always seemed to be on shift when these babies took a turn for the worse, and colleagues had quietly raised concerns about her well before the case ever became public. She was found guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others, making her the most prolific child serial killer in modern British history. Her trial stretched on for the better part of a year, and throughout it, she maintained her innocence, with her defense arguing the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. The jury didn't see it that way. In August of 2023, Letby was found guilty on all counts. But what happened next is what really cemented this case in people's minds. When sentencing day came, the families of her victims gathered in the courtroom, ready to read victim impact statements after waiting years for this moment. Letby refused to leave her prison cell and refused to appear by video link. So the judge, Mr. Justice Goss, had to deliver one of the most severe sentences available under British law to an empty dock. He told her, addressing her as if she was sitting right there, that she had acted in a way completely contrary to normal human instinct, and that she had shown a deep malevolence bordering on sadism toward the smallest and most vulnerable patients on that ward. Because Letby wasn't there, she never heard the victims' families describe what it's like to bury a baby, or to raise a surviving child, left permanently disabled because of what she did. One mother called Letby's refusal to appear just one final act of wickedness from a coward, and said she was actually grateful. Letby had taken the stand during the trial because it let the jury see what she was really like once the mask slipped. Other parents told the court that their surviving children, the ones Letby had tried and failed to kill, now live with permanent disabilities as a direct result of what she did to them on that ward. Letby was handed multiple whole-life orders, one for each offense, meaning she will spend the rest of her life in prison with absolutely no chance of release, becoming only the 4th woman in British history to receive that kind of sentence, alongside Myra Hindley, Rosemary West, and Joanna Dennehy. Her refusal to show up was so widely condemned that the Prime Minister at the time, Rishi Sunak, publicly called it a final act of cowardice, and it pushed the UK government to begin working on a law that would force convicted defendants to attend their own sentencing hearings going forward. In 2024, Letby was also found guilty at a retrial of the attempted murder of another baby, adding yet another whole-life order to her sentence. She has since tried to appeal her original convictions, but her initial bid was refused by the Court of Appeal. Chris McNab.
Since I'm pretty sure by the law states that I have a right to confront my witnesses who accuse me of doing wrong, so I felt like I wanted to say it in front of her since she was the one up here slandering me.
This last one comes out of Covington, Georgia, a small town not far from Atlanta. In October of 2017, Chris McNab and his girlfriend Courtney Bell were living together in a trailer park with their daughter Kalia, who was just 15 days old. The couple reported that Kalia had gone missing from their trailer, claiming someone had broken in during the night and taken her while everyone was asleep. For a brief moment, the case was treated as a possible abduction, and search teams combed the area. The very next day, a search party found Kalia's body in a wooded area near the property, wrapped inside one of McNab's t-shirts and stuffed inside a backpack. An autopsy showed she died from blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators described the couple's home as filthy and said the relationship between McNab and Bell was marked by violence and drug use, with both of them under the influence of crystal meth around the time Kalia died. The story the couple told police fell apart almost immediately, and by 2019 McNab went to trial and was convicted on 8 counts, including malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, child cruelty, and concealing a death. Bell was also convicted at the same trial and admitted she was guilty because of the drugs, though she said she never saw this coming. Parts of Bell's conviction were later overturned on appeal, and the Georgia Supreme Court eventually reversed the rest of her charges entirely, finding that the state had not proven Bell's conduct was directly tied to Kalia's death. During the trial, District Attorney Layla Zon told the jury that all of McNab's crying on camera during the missing person interviews and even his tears in the courtroom were nothing but an act, and that Kalia had been doomed from the moment she left the hospital. She told the jury that Kalia was a gift and that her parents took pure innocence and brought that child into a life of hell. Even after being found guilty, McNab stood up and continued to insist he was innocent, telling the judge he had maintained that from the very beginning. That's when Judge John Ott asked him something nobody expected. He asked McNab if he really was innocent, what sentence he thought the real killer of his daughter deserved. Without hesitation, McNab answered that whoever actually did it deserved the maximum sentence the law allowed. The judge agreed with him completely and immediately sentenced McNab himself to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 10 years, for a crime McNab had just told the court deserved nothing less than the maximum. The look on McNab's face when it registered what had just happened has been replayed thousands of times online. That moment has been clipped and shared online for years since, often described as a judge letting a killer pick out his own punishment without realizing it. McNab's case went all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court, where his legal team argued the evidence was largely circumstantial, since the conditions Kalia's body was found in had made it impossible to establish a direct scientific link to McNab. The justices found no reason to overturn his conviction or his sentence. As of now, McNab remains behind bars in Georgia, and every appeal he's filed has been denied.